A fighting bear sometimes uses his claws and sometimes his teeth. I've never known one to attempt to kill an antagonist simply by hugging, in spite of the popular belief to this effect. Although he will sometimes draw an enemy towards him with his paws, the better to reach him with his teeth, and to hold him so that he cannot escape from the biting. Nor does the bear often advance on his hind legs to the attack, although if the man has come close to him in thick underbrush or has stumbled on him in his lair unawares, he will often rise up in this fashion and strike a single blow. He will also rise in clinching with a man on horseback. In fact, in 1882, a mounted Indian was killed in this very manner on one of the river bottoms some miles below where my ranch house now stands, not far from the junction of the Beaver and Little Missouri. The bear had been hunted into a thicket by a band of Indians, in whose company my informant, a white squaw man, with whom I afterward did some trading, was traveling. One of them, in the excitement of the pursuit, rode across the end of the thicket, and as he did so, the great beast sprang at him with wonderful quickness, rising on its hind legs and knocking over the horse and rider with a single sweep of its terrible forepaws. It then turned on the fallen man and tore him open, and although the other Indians came promptly to his rescue and slew his assailant, they were not in time to save their comrade's life. Sometimes a single bite causes death. One of the most successful bear hunters that I ever knew, an old fellow whose real name I never even heard as he was always called Old Ike, he was killed in this way in the spring or early summer of 1886 on one of the headwaters of the Salmon. He was a very good shot and had killed nearly 100 bears with the rifle, and although often charged, he never met with any accident, so that he had grown somewhat careless. On the day in question, he had met a couple of mining prospectors and was traveling with them, when a grizzly crossed his path. The old hunter immediately ran after it, rapidly gaining, as the bear did not hurry when it saw itself pursued, but slouched slowly forwards, occasionally turning its head to grin and growl. It soon went into a dense grove of young spruce, and as the hunter reached the edge, it charged fiercely out. He fired one hasty shot, evidently wounding the animal, but not seriously enough to stop or even cripple it, and as his two companions ran forward, they saw the bear seize him with its widespread jaws, forcing him to the ground. They shouted and fired, and the beast abandoned the fallen man on the instant and sullenly retreated into the spruce thicket, whither they dared not follow it. Their friend was at his last gasp, though, for the whole side of the chest had been crushed in by the one bite. The lungs were showing between the rent ribs. Occasionally the bear, although vicious, is also frightened and passes on after giving one or two bites, and frequently a man who is knocked down is rescued by his friends before he's killed, the big beast mayhap using his weapons with clumsiness. So a bear may kill a foe with a single blow of its mighty forearm, either crushing in the head or chest by sheer force of sinew, or else tearing open the body with its formidable claws. And so on the other hand he may, and often does, merely disfigure or maim the foe by a hurried stroke. Hence it is common to see men who have escaped the clutches of a grizzly, but only at the cost of features marred beyond recognition, or a body rendered almost helpless for life. Almost every old resident of western Montana or northern Idaho has known 2 or 3 unfortunates who have suffered in this manner. I myself have met one such man in Helena and another in Missoula. Both were living at least as late as 1889, the date at which I last saw them. One had been partially scalped by a bear's teeth. The animal was very old, though, and so his fangs did not enter the skull. The other had been bitten across the face, and the wounds never entirely healed, so that his disfigured visage was hideous to behold. Most of these accidents occur in following a wounded or worried bear into thick cover, and under such circumstances, an animal apparently hopelessly disabled or in the death throes may with a last effort kill one or more of its assailants. In 1874, my wife's uncle, Captain Alexander Moore, and my friend, Captain Bates, with some men of the 2nd and 3rd Cavalry, were scouting in Wyoming near the Freeze-Out Mountains. One morning, they roused a bear in the open prairie and followed it at full speed as it ran towards a small creek. At one spot in the creek, beavers had built a dam, and as usual in such places, there was a thick growth of bushes and willow saplings. Just as the bear reached the edge of this little jungle, it was struck by several balls, both of its forelegs being broken. Nevertheless, it managed to shove itself forward on its hind legs and partly rolled, partly pushed itself into the thicket, the bushes, though, low being so dense that its body was at once completely hidden. The thicket was a mere patch of brush, not 20 yards across in any direction. The leading troopers reached the edge almost as the bear tumbled in. One of them, a tall and powerful man named Miller, instantly dismounted and prepared to force his way in among the dwarfed willows, which were breast high. Among the men who had ridden up were Moore and Bates, and also the two famous scouts, Buffalo Bill, long a companion of Captain Moore, and California Joe, who was Custer's faithful follower. California Joe had spent almost all his life on the plains and in the mountains as a hunter and an Indian fighter, and when he saw the trooper about to rush into the thicket, he called out to him not to do so, warning him of the danger. But the man was a very reckless fellow, and he answered by jeering at the old hunter for his overcaution in being afraid of a crippled bear. Well, California Joe made no further effort to dissuade him, remarking quietly, "Very well, Sonny, go in, it's your own affair." Miller then leaped off the bank on which they stood and strode into the thicket, holding his rifle at the port. Hardly had he taken 3 steps when the bear rose in front of him, roaring with rage and pain. It was so close that the man had no chance to fire. Its forearms hung useless, and as it reared unsteadily on its hind legs, lunged forward at him. He seized it by the ears and strove to hold it back. His strength was very great, and he actually kept the huge head from his face and braced himself so that he was not overthrown. But the bear twisted its muzzle from side to side, biting and tearing the man's arms and shoulders. Another soldier jumped down, slew the beast with a single bullet, and rescued his comrade. But though alive, he was too badly hurt to recover and ended up dying after reaching the hospital. Buffalo Bill was given the bear skin and, I believe, has it now. Theodore Roosevelt.
Perhaps the most underrated animal on the frontier was man's best friend, the dog. The dog would feature front and center in every aspect of life in the Old West. Dogs helped hunters obtain their food, helped herd their domestic animals, guard their homes, killed vermin, and for hundreds of years warned sleeping warriors of a prowling enemy while keeping them warm on cold nights. Here is a story of one dog that wouldn't quit.
The first time I ever met a panther face-to-face was in 1849, when I was near 12 years old. My parents were living on what is now the Joe Burleson Place, 1.5 miles above the mouth of George's Creek. My sister, Nancy Hudson, had married Adrian Howard, and they were living on Crooked Creek 1 mile below us, on what was afterward called the Roll Austin land. Late one evening, my parents told me and another sister of mine named Minerva Jane, who was 15 years old, to go down to Howard's and request him and Nancy to come home with us and stay all night with us. Foolish-like, we left the house without the protection of a dog. On our arrival at my sister's house, we found that her and Howard were gone. The sun had just hid itself below the western horizon, which caused us to delay but little time, and we turned and followed the trail back toward home. When we had gone a little more than halfway back home, we heard a loud scream back toward Howard's house, which frightened my sister, for she supposed Nancy had come back home since we were there, and that something had happened to her. We stopped, and Jane gave an answering cry. I told her it was not Nancy's voice, but she thought it was, and I could not convince her otherwise. The seemingly distressing cry continued at short intervals, and the sound was growing louder and drawing nearer, and my anxious sister kept on answering it. We stood in the pathway and listened at the approaching noise. Jane was expecting to see our sister coming to us, but I was looking for the approach of a panther. We owned 3 savage cur dogs and a half-bloodhound. In a short while longer, the cry ceased, and we stood in silence, waiting. It was now that my sister gave it up that it was not Nancy, and in a few seconds more we saw a monster panther approach us and stop in a few yards of where we stood. It crouched down in the path and began striking its tail against the ground. It was now a little dusky, and here we were in the growing shade of night in the presence of a stealthy panther. Realizing our peril, we turned and ran toward home, and hallooed for the dogs as we ran. The dogs heard us, and they came running and met us, and it was then that we felt much relieved and were comparatively safe. I and my sister stopped when we met the dogs and turned back and discovered the panther where we had left it. The dogs darted at it, and the beast bounded away. When the 3 cur dogs had got close enough to scent the panther, we were amazed at seeing them turn coward by stopping and whirling round and fled back toward the house. But the bloodhound was faithful and fearless and pursued the panther. I and sister went on home. Night closed in, and it proved to be a very dark one. The trusty hound did not return home that night. We heard him yelping at bedtime. It was too dark for Father to venture out. Then we heard the dog chasing the panther after we had all retired to bed. It seemed that the dreaded beast would not leave the neighborhood, and the hound was in hearing distance until we went to sleep. When daylight came, the dog was not at home and we could hear nothing of him. But an hour or so after sunrise, we heard the dog howl in a piteous way at the creek, at which we lived close to. We knew the poor animal was in distress and needed help, and I and Jeremiah Hudson, a brother of mine, ran down to the creek and found the brave creature lying helpless, close to the water. His body was torn and mangled. He had been in a desperate fight with the panther and was wounded unto death. But he had crawled that far toward home and, finding himself powerless to go any further, had howled to warn us of his distress. The suffering animal had certainly called for help in his dying condition. With tender hearts, we lifted him carefully in our arms and carried him to the house and did all we could to save him. But our efforts were fruitless, for he died in 2 hours after we had brought him to the house. Though only a dog, but he was true and brave and a favorite with the family. He had defended myself and sister in our perilous position, while the other 3 dogs turned their tails to the enemy and ran. Who can help loving a noble friend, even if this friend is only a dog? John B. Hudson.
Bobby Gill done it again. Last Wednesday was a lively day for Dodge. 200 cattlemen in the city, the gang in good shape for business, merchants happy, and money flooding the city is a condition of affairs that could not continue in Dodge very long without an eruption, and that is the way it was last Wednesday. Robert Gilmore was making a talk for himself in a rather emphatic manner, to which Marshal Dager took exceptions and started for the doghouse with him. Bobby walked very leisurely, so much so that Larry felt it necessary to administer a few paternal kicks in the rear. This act was soon interrupted by Bat Masterson, who wound his arm affectionately around the marshal's neck and let the prisoner escape. Dager then grappled with Bat, at the same time calling upon the bystanders to take the offender's gun and assist in the arrest. Joe Mason appeared upon the scene at this critical moment and took the gun. Bat Masterson would not surrender yet, and came near getting a hold of a pistol from among several which were strewed around over the sidewalk. But half a dozen Texan men came to the marshal's aid and gave him a chance to draw his gun and beat Bat over the head until the blood flew upon Joe Mason. that he kicked and warded off the blows with his arm. Bat Masterson seemed possessed of extraordinary strength, and every inch of the way was closely contested. But the city dungeon was reached at last, and in he went. If he had got hold of his gun before going in, there would have been a general killing. The fastidious Colonel Norton fell next. He ranks next to Bat Masterson in point of courage, being somewhat more cautious and much more inclined to make a bloodthirsty talk. He is said to be tolerably handy with his gun and fair to middling for shoulder hitting. Norton had been accused of ways that were dark and tricks that were vain in a poker game by a Texan and several other Texan men who took a hand in the game of talk which followed. Norton soon discovered that the gang was oversized and amiably went against the booze joint for the house, but the flowing bowl raised his courage above all cautionary measures, and he gave it out solid that he was a fighter and thirsted for blood. Sim Hoystein, a cattle drover, quietly gave it as his opinion that Mr. Norton couldn't fight very much, that there were several men in town he could not lick, like himself, for instance. A lightweight drover by the name of Lee then interfered and claimed the fight for himself. Norton and Lee then had a little scuffle, which was soon interrupted by the police. Larry soon after espied Norton in a crowd recommending himself as a fighter and ordered him to disperse. Norton proudly reminded Mr. Dager that he was a sovereign citizen of Dodge City and, as such, had certain inalienable rights. For answer, Mr. Dager promptly marched him to the doghouse. Edward Masterson accomplished his first official act in the arrest of Bobby Gilmore the same afternoon. Next day, Judge Prost administered the penalty of the law by assessing 25 and costs to Bat, 10 to Norton, and 5 to Bobby. The boys are all at liberty now.